The wind. Uh, I got a book called Wind. Mm, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Mm, mm. Uh-oh. Here we go. I got a book called Wind by Jan de Blue. The wind blew. It blew that way. Hello, friends. Let me show you who Jan de Blue is. Hmm. Yeah, can you see? Hmm. Uh, Jan de Blue is the author of Hatteras Journal, 1987, and of Meant to Be Wild, 1991, which was a Nature Book Club main selection and was chosen by Library Journal on the 3 best natural history books of the year. He's also written for New York Times Magazine, Smithsonian, Audubon, and Orion. Her essay on the wind, Into the Dragon's Mouth, was featured in the inaugural volume of American Nature Writing. He's a nature writer, and now he's written about the wind. Wait a minute, let me read something about the wind or about this book. Let's see. Oh, oh, let's see. Should I go here? Mm. So in Amazon, mm, oh, oh, there we go. Okay. So in Amazon, oh, in Amazon, I like to go there to find out what people think about this book. So there's The Wind. Oh, you can get it on Kindle. I think I'll get it on Kindle. Let's see if I can get it on Kindle. I have Kindle. I got it. Anyway, oh, go back to Zoom. Okay, okay. Now, how do I get back? Hmm. See if I can open it. Oh, okay. Let's see. So I'm going to look at what people say. Hmm. Cecil Botwell gave it 5 out of 5 stars. And the wind whispers, the blue, the blue, the blue. Reviewed in 2007. From Aeolian ecosystems, those formed by or dependent on wind, to to Zephyrs. Jan the Blue covers the globe, starting from the windy beach of her home island in North Carolina's Outer Banks. The author follows the upwellings, downdrafts, jet streams, and gales that govern. This journey includes balloon rides, windsurfing, hang gliding, hand shuffled excavations into the past life of the past lives of dunes, high-tech wind tunnels, and Navajo creation myths. Learn why rogue winds, upwards of 100 feet in height, form in mid-ocean and why onshore breezes draw fish fry spawned in ocean deeps through inlets into estuarine nurseries. Examine wind farming, particulate pollution, and acid rain in African interior jungles. It is an exhilarating tale, deeply spiritual and exuberant at once, told by one who loves the wind, even as she fears the tempest. If you savored the melding of intellect and awe, this one will, forgive me, blow you away. Was that helpful? uh, nobody found that one helpful. Look, this one's helpful. Think about it. Keeler wrote in 2000. If someone asked you to write a nonfiction, but also not totally scientific book about the wind, how much could you write? A few paragraphs? A few pages? Jan de Blue has written nearly 300 pages, not only about the wind, but also its effects. Her inspiration came from living on the Outer Banks of North Carolina and watching the wind blast this land, break the trees, scatter the wildlife, and discourage the people. In the book, De Blue discusses many facets to the wind and its effect. Mythology of the wind, the effects of the wind on history. Due to prevailing winds, Europeans had sailed to Brazil long before they set foot on Western Africa, as well as trees, birds, sand, ocean currents, and man himself. Man's attempt to confront the wind, such as skyscrapers whose windows are blown out in strong winds. Oh my. And to the use the wind, such as windmills for energy, are also discussed. But the facts presented in this book are only half the story. This is not a scientific book written in dry language. If that were so, this book would not be particularly interesting to a casual reader. But as the blurb on the back cover states, Jan de Blue brings a poet's voice and a scientist's eye to her study of the wind. And that is what makes the book so interesting. De Blue takes scientific descriptions and transforms them into sentences where you think, oh, I wish I could write like that. For example, just as it had shaped the history of mankind, the seasonal paths of animals, and the spread of vegetation, wind chisels the crust of the earth. It whistles around mountains and through passes, eroding rock as it gains speed. Bit by bit, it skims the top off plowed fields. It scatters ash from volcanic explosions and so creates some of the richest soil on earth. If you enjoy learning about the world around you, but are put off by scientific language, you will find this book to be, I can't avoid it, a breath of fresh air. Uh, so, the answer, my friend, is the wind. The wind. Wind energy. Hmm. But no, let's actually read some of it. Let's go. Well, I can't find it. Let's see. I wonder. I'll open up. Oh, let's see if I can do this. Is it Cloud dot Reader? Wait a minute. Let me go. Check. Uh, Amazon Cloud Reader. Hmm. Okay, it's called Read dot Amazon. Okay, so all you have to do is share. Hmm. Hmm. Let's see. Read dot Amazon dot com. Hmm. So there's the wind. So let's see. Let's see if I can find see, search. No, not it there. Oh, go back to the wind. Isn't there a search? Isn't there a search for this? I don't know to go to. So I hit this, those three dots. Mm, I can't seem to find a search, but let's see if I can find maybe about how do you go how do you move around in the location? Oh, maybe there's a way to. What's this? Let's see. Masters of the Breeze. Is it this one? Let's see. The Masters of. Oh, let's see. I'm looking for. See if I had the search, I would find it. I'm looking for a where she talks about oh pheromones. Mm, mm, mm. Wait a minute. It should be. Well, let's go back to this. Maybe it's in here. There's something about South Florida. Hmm. Hmm. Where was it that I read? I read it in the book physically. Oh, maybe I found it in the book. The Waltzing of Wind and Sand. So go to the Waltzing of Wind and Sand and then skim through this. Mhm. Hold on. It's pretty good read. I'm getting warm. Mm, look, this is interesting. Until the late 18th century, geologists believed that rock structures were formed exclusively by sudden cataclysmic events such as the eruption of volcanoes and the thrusting up of mountains. But by the turn of the 20th century, it was known that the formation of rock sometimes required millions of years. Millions of years. But even then, scientists generally assumed that the Earth's terrain was shaped mostly by water, rain, rivers, expanding and contracting seas. The role of wind was not given its due until the 1930s when the plowed soils of the American Midwest began blowing away by the ton. By the ton. In 1925, Ralph Algiers Bagnold, a young officer in the British Royal Engineers, was stationed in Abbasiyah in the outskirts of Cairo. Bagnold was a student of fluid mechanics and a careful observer. He took to exploring the Libyan desert with some other men, spending his occasional 10-day leaves driving through the trackless sands. Traveling the desert became Bagnold's passion. As often as possible, he abandoned the city in favor of the sense of freedom to go just where one liked, driving on a compass course with the awe of a new and utterly lifeless world. With the clean coolness of sand dunes in the evening and the dry, sparkling desert air, he returned to England a few years later, determined to seek explanations for all he had seen. For the rest of his life, he immersed himself in studying elegant waltzing of wind and sand. And so in 1941, Bagnold published The Physics of Blown Sand and Desert Dunes, which remains the primer for students of Aeolian geology. He begins the book with an examination of the movements of individual sand grains as they are tossed and tumbled by the wind. Well, let's count like sand. A grain first starts to move by rolling, becoming airborne only when it runs into a barrier of some sort. A pebble, a bush, a crest of hardened sediment. It hops into air, lands, and is thrown upward again, bouncing across the landscape, bigger strides as the wind accelerates. This hopscotch is called saltation. Wherever the grain lands, it forms a tiny crater, and its impact sets other grains in motion. Bagnold conducted painstaking tests in simple wind tunnels to study the path of individual grains and their behavior under different wind regimes. He found that sand grains bounce much higher when blown over a surface of cobblestones than when they pass over sand. He demonstrated that sand ripples away from fo- that that sand ripples that sand ripples always forms at right angles to prevailing winds. And he showed that sand exerts force on wind as well as vice versa. Once grains begin to saltate, the surface winds that set them in motion are slowed by friction. Bagnall's fascination was not with coastal dunes, which are often chaotic and formless, but with the great deserts where wind and sand are unaffected by humans. With no barriers to block its passage, no vegetation to tie it down, sand shifts into globed and tapered piles that change daily, hourly. An observer, he writes, never fails to be amazed at the simplicity of form, an exactitude of repetition, and a geometric order unknown in nature on a scale larger than that of a crystalline structure. He celebrates dunes lined up in parallel ranges, peak following peak, in regular succession, like the teeth of a monstrous saw, for scores, even hundreds of miles. He wonders at the phenomena known as singing or booming sand, which in some remote places startles the silence of the desert. Its cause, he finds, is the avalanching of grains, which slow and moan as they reach the bottom of a steep slope. And he marvels that two large dunes sometimes breed by colliding and then rolling onward, leaving behind a new small dune. Such grotesque imitation of life, he writes, is vaguely disturbing to an imaginative mind. The major dune shapes Bagnall describes barchans or crescentic dunes, which have steep slip faces and gradually sloped backsides, seefs or sword-shaped dunes, which stretch forward in long swirls like curlicue waves drawn across a page, and sand levees or whalebacks seem like species of animals as much as variations in landforms. Scientists have since added other forms such as the parabolics, which migrate by pushing their rounded noses forward and tucking their arms behind them. Patterns of wind shaped them all with sure and beautiful strokes. Bagnall's work stood virtually alone in the field of alien a- aeolian geology until the 1970s, when the formation of the Mideast oil cartel spawned a flurry of research into modern sand seas and the oil fields below them. During the same period, observations taken from the Viking and Mariner spacecrafts showed that windstorms have been instrumental in shaping the terrain of Mars. Although the field of aeolian geology has greatly expanded since the 1960s, it is still a specialty science. Have-Home estimates that no more than 24 scientists in the world actively study wind-blown sand. Some are probing the processes of the sediment transport on Mars and Titan. A few are exploring the qualities of loess in Mongolia and North China, where whole cities have been carved into its thick, buffy beds. Most aeolian geologists, however, study what they call the rock record of sand seas and sandstone. Geologists work by analogy, Have Holmes says. They examine modern processes and then look at places like Zion National Park and run the scenario backward. There's a phrase used to describe it: the present is the key to the past. The overriding assumption is that many of the same basic processes at work today were also at work when ancient sandstones were formed. Some Aeolian geologists study sand movement in the microscale using time lapse photography and computer models to analyze how ripples form under certain conditions, or how a combination of waves and wind carves out cusps along a beach. Others look at the behavior of single dunes and whole seas of dunes. Much of this latter work is done by computer analysis. Eventually, however, all theories must be tested in the field using the same laborious trenching techniques employed by Havholm. There are a few tricks to making the work go quicker, she says. You can take samples with a vibrocore, which is basically a big shaft attached to a lawnmower motor that drives it into the ground. But that works best in wet sediments. I haven't had much luck with vibrocores in dry sand, and I don't know anyone who has. Once a trench reveals the pale stripes known as laminations, the geologist must decipher them with great care. As sand rolls and saltates and slides, the dense minerals within it sort themselves into layers that can be easily seen. Each stripe may represent any of a number of things: a sustained wind ripple, a spot where sand adheres to a damp surface, or no, a grain flowed down the advancing face of a dune. By examining grain patterns and doing various calculations to compare the angle of a stripe and the orientation of the trench wall, trench walls, investigators can determine the direction in which a dune moved. Such clues may elegantly reveal where a large, quickly migrating dune overtook a slower, smaller ridge, or they may simply confound the researchers. More than once, I've been in the field with what I think is an ironclad theory, Havholm says, grinning ruefully, and the cross strata have blown it completely out of the water. Dig and dig, take notes and pictures, pause to evaluate theories, to study old topographic maps and aerial photos. These are the tasks that fill Havholm's days from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. During her short weeks in the field. Often when I ask a question, she replies, "I'm not sure. I haven't thought that one through yet." After spending a day with her, I fall exhausted into bed. I dream of sand spilling in hot velvet tongues down the side of a dune, spreading out in fans, accumulating grain by grain until it smothers the forest that stands in its path. In 1991, when the Aeolian geologist Gary Kokorek, one of the field's preeminent scholars, and Karen Havholm examined Run Hill, part of the dune was owned by the County Board of Education, which planned to build a high school on its crest. Nature Conservancy officials feared that the construction would cause severe erosion on the remaining section of the dune. If the dune lost much elevation, it would no longer shield Nag's Head woods from maritime winds, and the forest would likely die. The planned site of the school has since been moved, and proceedings and proceedings have been started to bring Run Hill under the ownership of the North Carolina Park System. Metal rods have been driven into the dune in a grid pattern so Have Home can monitor changes in sand accretion. There are two parts to what I'm studying: the history of the dunes under the woods and the status of Run Hill as a modern migrating dune. She says Run Hill has lost its sand supply. Most of the sand fields to the east that historically fed it have been stabilized by lawns and houses and driveways. So the question is, how long can it survive? It is late afternoon, and Have Home and I are standing on the crest of Run Hill, one of my favorite places on the Outer Banks. The sides of the dunes are bone white, but scattered patches of dark and light sand model its top like Appaloosa hide. Overhead, clouds skate quickly by on a building uh, southwest breeze. As the wind set grains of sand bouncing, the lines between air and earth blurs. Thanks to Have Home's tutelage, I know that here at the top of the dune, the layers of wind squeeze together as they ascend are picking up speed and sand. Once the wind pass over the crest and start down, they will spread out and drop much of their load. Whew. And it goes on and on. The answer is just blowing in the wind. All this sand is just being moved around and creating new shapes all the time. Moving. Woo. Mm. And it goes on and on. But I was looking for something about Pheromone. Maybe it's coming up. Mm-mm-mm. Mm. Decircling seas. No, no. I wish there was a way to look upwards. Can't seem to find it. Maybe it's go to location. Go to location. Uh, hmm, mm, I can't find it. I wish there was a way to search. I can't. I can't do it here. Well, I know how though. I can go to Kindle, my own Kindle, Wind, and then open it, and then go pher- pheromone. Pheromone? Hmm. Page 10109, 27%. Okay, so I could go to, oh, let's see. It's more like, hmm, maybe it's right around there. Masters of the Breeze. Maybe I've already read this. I don't think so. Hmm. Talks about birds. Let's see. There, I will start. Uh, 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 uh. Birds, spiders. Oh, this might be it. No other class of animals lives so starkly at the mercy of wind as the insects. In its benign convective form, wind plucks up bugs by the millions, the trillions every day, and scatters them widely. This is not to say they are dispersed at random. Biologists have often seen insects choose a precise moment to set out, say just before the onset of a light rainstorm with the west bearing winds, presumably so that they are most likely to arrive in protected food rich habitat. Once aloft, they depend on horizontal currents to ferry them onward. Often they drift all night. In the upper strata, they encounter waves of turbulence and layers of different densities that sort and compress them into compact swarms. They may drift as a unit through honeycombs of thermals and land lightly in a rogue's paradise, a flower garden, a newly cultivated field of vegetables. Or they may be accosted by a freshening gale, tossed out to the sea, and slammed rudely into the water. Many insects are wingless, at least in their larval forms, and must depend entirely on wind for transit. Those that can fly have neither the mass nor the strength to fight headwinds, so they ride the breeze, perhaps passively, perhaps with some precise collective plan. In certain species, individuals bunch together like flocks of birds, turning as one organism. In studies conducted during the 1950s, aphids carried by west winds from the irrigated oasis of Southern California into the arid basin of the Colorado Desert showed an uncanny knack for finding potted alfalfa plants left out for them. Some investigators speculate that spiders and other balloon riding creatures may control their altitude by trimming the lengths of silk that lift them. At present, however, scientists do not know whether insect wayfarers have anything but the crudest ability to navigate from one habitat to another. Until the 1920s, researchers were unaware that insects can survive well up into the troposphere. It has been known for a century that the smallest insects could be easily transported by wind. In 1827 and again in 1924, British Arctic explorers discovered live spruce aphids and syrphid flies on the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen. Apparently, they had been carried by wind from Russia, 800 miles away. Monarch butterflies had been observed 500 miles from land over the South Pacific, and once a swarm of migratory locusts was seen over the North Atlantic, 1,500 miles from land. With the spread of European gypsy moth larvae through the eastern United States during the early 1920s, research into the dispersal of insects took on special urgency. In uh, In 1973, no, in 1926, Perry Glick, an entomologist in Louisiana, made a series of flights in which he sampled the fauna of the air with traps made of wire screen mounted on the wings of a small biplane. Few scientists had tried to examine life in the upper atmosphere, and Glick's study is regarded as a pioneering work. At 200 feet, he found a great number of diversity of insects. He caught by far the most when the wind velocities were between 5 and 8 miles an hour. Lesser winds seemed to discourage insect flight. Greater winds made it nearly impossible. So above 300 feet, the insect populations rapidly thin. Nevertheless, Glick found a few spiders and flies as high as 5,000 feet. He never devised an accurate means of measuring the flow of convection currents in the upper atmosphere, but on days when the plane encountered turbulent air, he caught many more bugs at 1,000 feet, as if strong thermals had tossed them to unusual heights. Over 5 years, Glick trapped 700 identifiable species. In the end, he calculated that on any midsummer day, the air above each square mile of Louisiana contained more than 14 million insects. Each square mile has 14 million insects in the column of air on any midsummer day. Many insects travel at night, presumably to avoid the upper air turbulence caused by convection. Most individuals migrate no more than 5 miles over the course of their lives. Only a few species embark on lengthy seasonal movements, and then largely because of their proximity to favorable avenues of wind. Monarch butterflies migrating from the eastern United States to their overwintering grounds in Mexico follow routes that parallel the major flyways used by birds. In North American interior and in northern China and Japan, all regions where winters tend to be particularly severe, certain butterfly species ride jets of warm air north with the coming spring. Mm. The best documented relationship between migrating insects and wind involves the locusts of the African deserts, which move in great swarms with seasonal shifts of the intertropical convergence zone. In biblical Egypt, a plague of locusts was delivered by east winds. And indeed, wind is one of the key factors, although far from the only one, that governs the occasional explosion of locust populations and the wanderings of these voracious crop pests throughout the world. And it goes on, talks about locusts, wind's role in transportation of insects. The field expanded dramatically in the 1970s and early 80s. Oh, here's where it talks about pheromone. Let's see. Shortly after the turn of the 20th century, biologists discovered that insects widely use what were then called sex attractions to lure in mates. Despite the significance of this discovery, subsequent research proceeded slowly. But in the 1950s, investigators at last succeeded in isolating bomb icol, the primary sex pheromone emitted by the silkworm moth. The silkworm moth emits pheromone, a pheromone called bombicol. The field expanded dramatically during the 1970s and early 80s, but pheromone research demands particularly exacting and patient technique. The subjects are small and delicate, and even in the best conditions, they release minute amounts of the chemicals under examination. In addition, it is difficult to prove that a certain substance elicits a presumed response. Working in wind tunnels, biologists can manipulate one variable at a time. They have been able to calibrate the exact conditions under which different species are most likely to play out plumes of odoriferous bait. But they cannot watch how scents disperse through fields and forests, or from what distance suitors fly upwind to find the source. Nevertheless, from nearly a century of sporadic research, scientists have reached a few salient conclusions. First, to create a plume, an insect must fan its scent, either by flapping its wings or releasing the scent into the wind. So it requires less energy to stroke pheromone producing glands during periods of gentle breeze. But if necessary, the insect will begin calling, as biologists say, in dead calm. And if a heavy wind springs up, the release of pheromones stops as the insects seek cover. Second, the second great discovery that these scientists have found after a century of slow research. Second, each species sends out scent signals on select channels to which its own kind is listening. That is, it emits particular compounds of odors in distinct rhythms at specific times of the day and only in certain seasons. This phenomenon has been particularly well documented in butterflies and moths. To follow a pheromone trail, an insect does not set a straight bearing but engages in a sophisticated pattern of zigzag flight that apparently takes it in and out of the odor plume. A scent is like any other substance released into the air. A gust of wind may stretch it thin or send it curling backward. By casting back and forth, insects apparently can gauge how an odor has been pulled by the wind and better follow its source. Recent wind tunnel experiments by Thomas Baker and Neil Vickers of Iowa State University have found that when male tobacco budworms encounter the strands of odor-laden air, they will fly hard into the wind. But when they are surrounded by continuous clouds of pheromone scent, they seem to become disoriented, and their flight toward the pheromone source stops. It is as if both it is as if both the pulses of odor and the pockets of clean air between them serve as directional signals. The faster the male budworms encounter whiffs of pheromone, the more quickly they fly to its source. A number of pheromones have been manufactured synthetically and eventually may be widely marketed as the natural pesticides. One method calls for permeating a breeding habitat with a single scent, effectively jamming the airways so pests cannot find mates. Oh, what a horrible. How evil can man be? Pheromones have also been used in traps. Traps to monitor the spread of insect populations, and with less success as bait in population control experiments. So, following a plume upwind, the would-be perpetrators become trapped in cages or on sticky boards, the quintessential prisoners of desire. Wind is God's agent of transport, a living broom that sweeps flying animals into great swirls and piles. It carries them over rivers and seas and on rising columns, up mountainsides. At times, it sets them down in barren, high altitude nooks where only the hardiest organisms can survive. Hmm. Oh, I lost my place. Uh, yeah, since the 1970s. Uh, but, okay. Hmm. Lawrence Swan is a professor emeritus of biology at San Francisco State University. Early in an introductory conversation, he tells me he was born and raised in the Himalaya, but he pronounces it distinctly as Himalaya. Himalaya. It's a Sanskrit word that means abode of snow. The abode of snow. Himalaya. He has been smitten with the mountains all his life. On their honeymoon in 1946, he and his bride explored Chitlal Tepetl, an 18,700-foot peak in Mexico. And he says, we got separated, and I left her on top by mistake. She hasn't let me forget it since. In 1954, Swan was part of the first American expeditions into the Himalayas after World War II. He had a particular purpose for making the trip. During the honeymoon on Chipla Tepetl, he had noticed some lizards feeding at unusually high altitudes. And he wanted to see if he could find similar species in India. Also, 30 years earlier, a British expedition had discovered a curious jumping spider on Mount Everest at 22,000 feet. All spiders are predaceous. What could they have been feeding on? Swan wondered. At a height of 4 miles, as he and his companions made their way tediously up Mount Makalu, he paused to root through a 6-foot pile of rocks. It's a sort of biological dictum that animals can't survive in a region without green plants, he says. So I started digging around a bit and found some little collembolas, some springtails. And my gosh, if there wasn't a little sheen of something on the rock, I took a piece of paper and scraped it. The sheen turned out to be pollen. In the crevices between rocks, Swan found thin accumulations of plant fragments, seeds, spores, and bits of insects, food carried to the mountain by the wind. 6 years later, Swan returned to the Himalayas for an extended trip. Over 6 months, he walked 1,000 miles through the mountains and compiled one of the most extensive collections of Nepalese animals and plants in the world. He also confirmed his suspicions that a previous unknown ecological system, one supported entirely by wind, exists in the most baked and oxygen-starved landscape on Earth. In subsequent work on Chitlal Tepeto, Swan described the terrestrial, aquatic, and nival, that is, snow-locked, components of what he called the Aeolian biome. I named it, of course, for the Greek god of the wind. The Aeolian zone begins a bit above the tundra zone and consists of a patchwork of isolated ecological niches that are created where currents of wind, having lost speed and strength, drop a rain of algae and insects. At times, the snowfields of the Aeolian zone turn green or pink from the accumulation of wind dropped microscopic plants. The algae and insect carcasses attract tiny but sturdy scavengers, salticid spiders, daddy longlegs, jumping bristletails, annelid worms that can survive encased within ice. These in turn feed lizards, salamanders, rattlesnakes, a few species of birds. Snowmelt forms pools inhabited by delicate springtails and fairy shrimp, where water pours in muddy torrents from the mouths of glaciers. Stone flies congregate in dense clouds, feeding on wind-borne debris that may have been trapped in the ice for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. With the intense solar radiation and the thinning atmosphere, life at such heights must withstand extreme swings in temperature. Bacteria collected for Swan at 27,600 feet by a 1963 expedition to Mount Everest showed adaptations to freezing and thawing each day. One form was so unlike any other on the Earth that it defied classification. If there could be any wind-blown organic nutrient on Mars, this or a similar organism would be the best candidate for survival on that planet. In 1992, Swan published a paper in the journal Bioscience summarizing his career's work. In the conclusion, he suggested that wind-dependent life may be common throughout the world. In particular, He mentioned the interior of Antarctica, where wind-borne nutrients could conceivably support an assemblage of animals too small to be discerned by casual observations or from photographs. But by recognizing that similar Aeolian ecosystems have evolved in the coldest, most far-flung regions of Earth, scientists could incorporate Antarctica into the normal domain of biogeography, Swan wrote. The word Aeolian could also replace such map makers' terms as barren, glaciated, and snow or ice used to mark the lands beyond the tundra, and that imply a misleading sterility. In closing, Swan asked a provocative question. What if the first terrestrial organisms were not plants, as is commonly believed, but animals that fed on nutrients carried to them from the sea by wind? He noted that even now, organic rich compounds from evaporated sea foam can be found in snow on some of the highest peaks in the world. He described a bristletail he had discovered living on the Barren Glacier in the Himalayas, among the tumbling rocks between the moving ice crevices, in an environment that would challenge comparison with the niche of any other animal. It survived on windborne debris, a frontier creature of the Aeolian region. Might be might it be related to the earliest bristletails of the of the Devonian period? Might not creatures that evolved 390 million years ago also have lived solely by the grace of wind? The paper elicited dozens of requests for reprints, but to Swan's disappointment, no scientific response. You can show someone an Aeolian system, and at first they won't believe you. They don't think anything's really there. It takes a while for the concept to be absorbed by the mind, for even astute scientists to realize just how many insects and animals survive on what is brought to them by the wind. That's it for today. Looking at the wind. You know, my friends, the answer may be blowing in the wind. Had to do that. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoyed my exploration into the book, The Wind, by Jan de Blue. It was written in 1998, looks like. Yes, he's got a copyright. There's no second or third edition. This is the only edition. So 300 pages just talking about the wind. How incredible is that? Could you write that much on just the wind? It just blows my mind. And I've often wondered, what did Bob Dylan mean by the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind? The answer is blowing in the wind. Does it mean that we just have to catch it or something? There's a wind. Catch the answer. Maybe it's there. Eat it. Or listen to the wind. Maybe you find the answer there. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it. And many blessings. And what else? Any benefit, any this supposed deserved merit that I may have acquired, any good karma, any good works I may have, I may consider claiming. I will disclaim it and give it away to all my kind mothers, all my sentient beings, all my friends and enemies. Thank you very much, and strangers too. Bye.